The first human warning arrived after the fourth planet burned and no one listened. The galaxy had already decided what power looked like long before humanity ever spoke its name, and power, as the Car Dominion understood it, was measured in fleets dark enough to eclipse suns and weapons loud enough to be felt through vacuum. The Car were old conquerors, their empire mapped in scarred star systems in obedient worlds, and when they crossed into the outer neutral zones, their advance was treated as inevitable rather than alarming. Entire civilizations had folded when the Car banners appeared in orbit, and so when their armadas turned toward the spiral arm humans quietly inhabited, the council chambers filled not with panic, but with bored resignation. The humans, after all, had no visible fleets worth naming, no empire borders etched in red, no history of conquest anyone bothered to remember. They were catalogued as clever but contained, loud but limited, a species that argued endlessly among itself and spent more time debating ethics than sharpening blades. The Car laughed when their strategists reviewed the data, because a species that worried about consequences, in their experience, had already lost. The first planet fell in 37 minutes, its orbital defenses reduced to drifting wreckage before its surface transmissions even finished screaming. The second tried to negotiate and was silenced mid-sentence. The third burned so completely that its star briefly flared from the reflected fire. By the time the fourth world shattered under directed gravity weapons, the galaxy leaned back and waited for the human surrender that always followed demonstrations like this. Somewhere, millions of listeners followed the war feeds the way ancient humans once followed storms, unable to look away, knowing destruction was coming, but powerless to stop it. If you're hearing this now, the voice that narrates these events would later say, you're one of the few who stayed to watch when the easy story began to crack. The first sign was that the humans did not respond with a fleet. They did not rush warships into the contested systems or issue dramatic declarations promising vengeance. Instead, a single transmission appeared across every open channel the Car used, clear and calm, repeating until even the most arrogant warlord could not pretend it wasn't there. "This is a boundary notification from the United Human Systems," the voice said, neither pleading nor threatening. "You have exceeded acceptable thresholds of collateral damage. Please halt operations and withdraw." The Car admirals laughed openly, some broadcasting their amusement as they ordered the fifth world targeted, because acceptable thresholds were a concept for weak species that needed excuses to stop fighting. Power meant finishing what you started. The fifth world was glassed in under an hour. The sixth never even saw the ships that killed it. The council debated sanctions and statements while the casualty numbers climbed into the billions, and still the humans did not attack. Instead, a second transmission followed, identical in tone, but different in content. "This conflict is now being recorded as irreversible," it said. "Further actions will result in enforced termination of strategic options." The phrase meant nothing to the Car, whose doctrine taught that victory erased consequences, and whose history proved that fear ended resistance faster than mercy. They announced a final push, a decisive campaign that would break the human systems and add them to the long list of obedient territories. And their fleets surged forward in formations perfected over millennia. That was when something subtle happened. Something so quiet it didn't make headlines at first. Across the war zone, Car supply chains began to fail. Hyperlane beacons flickered and went dark without explosions. Command relays started misrouting orders, turning coordinated strikes into scattered confusion. Worlds already conquered fell silent, not from rebellion, but from absence, their occupying forces unable to receive new commands or reinforcements. Car engineers blamed sabotage, then malfunction, then enemy interference they could not detect. The humans still did not fire a shot. Instead, a third message arrived, this one addressed not to admirals, but to anyone listening. "We are not measuring this war by what we can destroy," the human voice said. We are measuring it by what will remain when it ends. The lines spread across civilian networks, replayed and dissected, and somewhere between the seventh and eighth destroyed worlds, people began to understand that something unprecedented was unfolding. The car continued forward anyway, because stopping was not part of their culture, and retreat was worse than annihilation. Their armadas entered the human core approach routes expecting resistance and finally got it, but not in the way they understood. Human vessels appeared, not in massive formations, but alone or in small numbers, slipping between car fleets without engaging, ignoring capital ships entirely, while targeting something else. Navigation arrays failed first, leaving massive warships blind and drifting. Then weapon systems locked themselves down, safety interlocks engaging as if the ships no longer trusted their own crews. Life support remained stable, shields intact, hulls untouched, but the fleets could no longer fight, move, or even retreat. Panic spread through command channels as entire armadas realized they were intact and utterly powerless, floating monuments to force without purpose. A single human ship finally hailed the nearest car flagship, its image appearing on screens across the fleet, showing a human tactician with tired eyes and a voice that carried neither hatred nor triumph. "Anyone can destroy a world," he said, as calmly as explaining weather. "Power is being able to stop and choosing not to." The car demanded terms, threatened retaliation, swore revenge, but the human only shook his head. "There will be no victory here," he said. "Not for you, not for us." The war feeds cut abruptly after that, replaced by silence that stretched for days. And when information finally returned, the galaxy learned the most terrifying truth of all. The war had ended without a final battle, without a treaty, without surrender, because humanity had removed the very idea of winning from the conflict, leaving the car with nothing to conquer and nowhere to go. And as stunned civilizations tried to understand what that meant, a new transmission began quietly spreading, one that suggested this was only the first consequence humanity had decided to enforce.
The silence after the human transmission was worse than any bombardment, because it forced the galaxy to confront what it had just witnessed without distraction. Entire car armadas hung motionless in contested space, their hulls unscarred, their crews alive, their weapons useless, and their command hierarchies broken not by force, but by absence. The war feeds resumed slowly, cautiously, as if afraid the truth might change if observed too closely, and what they showed unsettled even the oldest species. Car warships drifted like abandoned monuments, their engines locked into permanent standby, their navigation systems stripped of coordinates, their jump drives reduced to inert metal that no longer recognized space as something that could be crossed. Engineers tore through control rooms, ripping panels open, bypassing safeguards, even attempting manual detonations of their own reactors, but nothing worked. The ships refused to escalate. The systems refused to obey. It was as if the concept of violence had been politely but firmly removed from their machines. Across the galaxy, viewers leaned closer, some realizing they were holding their breath, others quietly subscribing to the feeds that carried this unfolding nightmare, sensing that history was bending in a direction no one had planned for. The Car High Warlord finally spoke, broadcasting from a throne room carved from the remains of conquered worlds, his voice thick with controlled fury, as he declared the humans cowards for refusing honorable battle. He promised retaliation, vowed that the Dominion would adapt, would rebuild, would return stronger, because power always found a way. The human response arrived within seconds, not to him alone, but to every government, every military command, every civilian network that would listen. "Retaliation requires capacity," the human tactician said, his image steady and unshaken. "Capacity requires infrastructure. Infrastructure requires permission."
With that single statement, the galaxy realized the war had already expanded far beyond the contested systems. Reports began flooding in from Car space itself, worlds far from the front lines where no human ships had ever been seen. Orbital factories had halted production without warning. Automated mines shut down, their AI cores locked behind encryption no Car code could penetrate. Even planetary defense grids, the pride of the Dominion, entered dormant states that could not be reversed. Nothing was destroyed, nothing was sabotaged in the traditional sense. Everything was simply paused. The Car had spent centuries perfecting the art of taking, of extracting value from conquered systems, of converting worlds into fuel for further conquest, and in the span of days, that entire engine ground to a halt. Panic rippled through their hierarchy as supply shortages began to appear, not from blockades, but from the sudden inability to move resources at all. The human voice returned, softer now, almost instructional, explaining what had been done in terms even civilians could understand. "We mapped your war economy centuries ago," it said. "We studied how your fleets feed, how your weapons are powered, how your command authority propagates. We did not attack your soldiers, because soldiers follow incentives. We removed the incentives." Across council space, ambassadors who had once dismissed humanity as naive now sat in stunned silence, replaying the words again and again, trying to grasp the implication. The humans had not just ended a war, they had redefined what war meant. There were no glorious last stands, no heroic sacrifices, no decisive battles to commemorate. Only a vast, suffocating stillness where aggression no longer functioned as a strategy. Some council members quietly voiced relief, others fear, because if power could be applied so selectively, so surgically, then no one could be certain they were safe simply because they were peaceful. The humans anticipated this, of course. A separate transmission followed, addressed to the council itself, its tone measured and almost weary. "This intervention is not punishment," it said. "It is correction. The Car Dominion has demonstrated an inability to stop once escalation begins. We have therefore stopped escalation for them. They may keep their worlds, their people, their culture. What they will not keep is the ability to project violence beyond their borders." A murmur spread through the galaxy at that, a mixture of awe and dread, because the idea of a species losing its capacity for war without being conquered was unprecedented. The Car High Warlord raged publicly, denouncing the humans as tyrants, accusing them of imposing a soft tyranny worse than open rule. But his words rang hollow as reports confirmed that his own palace defenses had quietly powered down. No human soldiers marched through Car cities, no flags were planted. Life went on, but something fundamental was missing, like a predator waking to find its claws gone. Then came the twist no one expected. A small Car border world sent a request for aid, not military, but humanitarian, reporting famine as supply networks failed. The council debated, paralyzed by uncertainty, until the humans responded first. Aid ships arrived within hours, human-marked vessels delivering food, medical support, and engineers who worked openly alongside Car civilians. They did not demand loyalty or tribute. They did not even ask for gratitude. They simply helped and left. The feeds captured Car citizens staring at human relief workers with expressions that ranged from suspicion to something dangerously close to hope. Somewhere in the darkness, the human tactician watched these scenes unfold and allowed himself a brief, private breath, because this, not the disabled fleets, was the real experiment. The galaxy was about to learn whether a civilization built on conquest could survive without it, and whether mercy imposed from a position of absolute power would breed peace or resentment. As analysts argued and viewers speculated in comment threads across 1,000 worlds, a final, encrypted alert flashed across human command networks only, carrying data from beyond known space. Another empire had been watching, one far older than the car, and it had just begun mobilizing. The alert did not announce itself with alarms or flashing warnings, because humanity had learned long ago that panic was a waste of time. It arrived as a quiet update in secured channels, flagged by probability curves and long-term threat modeling rather than fear. An empire designated only as the Threx Continuum had shifted from observational posture to active mobilization, their fleet movements subtle but unmistakable to anyone who knew what to look for. They were older than the car, older than most council civilizations, and unlike the Dominion, they did not glorify war. They optimized it. The Threx measured power the same way the galaxy always had, by force projection and control, but with a patience that made their conquests slow, methodical, and almost invisible until it was too late. For centuries, they had expanded without drawing attention, absorbing weaker species through economic pressure, cultural erosion, and targeted strikes that left no dramatic ruins to warn the rest of the galaxy. When the car collapsed into enforced stillness, the Threx noticed immediately, not with alarm, but with interest, because sudden absences of violence created opportunities. Council analysts began to piece together fragments of intelligence that had been ignored for generations, realizing with a sinking feeling that entire regions of space labeled as neutral or stable were, in fact, quietly controlled by the continuum. While diplomats argued and commentators speculated, the Threx began moving assets toward human-influenced space, not in armadas, but in carefully distributed nodes, each one designed to test boundaries without triggering overt retaliation. Humanity responded not with fleets, but with silence, and that silence unsettled the Threx more than any show of force. They had expected posturing, negotiations, perhaps threats, because every power eventually wanted to be seen. Humans, instead, continued their humanitarian efforts in former car territories, continued integrating limited technology-sharing programs with council worlds that agreed to strict non-aggression frameworks, and continued acting as if the Threx did not exist. This was a mistake, the Threx leadership concluded, because ignoring a predator only worked if you were confident it could not strike. The first probe was launched under the guise of trade, a Threx commercial delegation requesting access to human systems to discuss mutual security interests. The Council watched nervously as the humans agreed, because nothing about the continuum was ever truly commercial. The meeting was broadcast with unusual transparency, the human representative appearing calm and unarmed, the Threx envoy a shifting, angular form whose species had evolved to read micro-expressions across a dozen sensory spectrums. "We admire your efficiency," the Threx envoy said, its voice modulated to sound almost pleasant. "You have neutralized a major destabilizing force without open conflict. Such restraint suggests intelligence. We propose cooperation." The human smiled slightly, not with warmth, but with understanding. "Cooperation toward what end?" he asked. "Stability," the envoy replied. "Order. The reduction of unnecessary suffering." Words that sounded noble enough to fool younger civilizations, but the human did not interrupt, letting the Threx outline a vision of shared governance where humanity's technological superiority would complement the continuum's experience managing large populations. The pitch was elegant, logical, and deeply unsettling because it framed domination as benevolence. When the envoy finished, the human leaned forward just enough for the cameras to catch the shift. "You are very good at this," he said quietly. "You have convinced yourselves that control is compassion." The Threx did not deny it. "Control prevents chaos," the envoy replied. "Chaos causes suffering. Humanity has seen what unrestrained violence looks like. Join us, and we can ensure it never happens again." Across the galaxy, viewers leaned in, sensing that this conversation mattered more than any battle because it would define what kind of power humanity intended to wield. The humans' response was calm, but carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "You misunderstand our position," he said. "We did not stop the car to create a more efficient hierarchy. We stopped them because suffering cannot be justified by outcome alone." The Threk's envoy's sensory fronds stiffened slightly, the equivalent of a raised eyebrow. "Idealism is a luxury of those who have never governed billions," it said. Humanity's smile faded. "We govern ourselves," he replied. "That is how we know the cost." The meeting ended without agreement, polite on the surface but cold beneath, and within days the Threks began their real test. A minor council world on the edge of human-influenced space experienced a sudden economic collapse, its trade routes disrupted by perfectly legal maneuvers, its currency destabilized by market pressures no one could trace to a single source. Protests erupted, then violence, then pleas for intervention. The Threks waited, confident that humans who claimed to oppose domination would hesitate to interfere in what could be framed as internal instability. Humanity did not hesitate. A single announcement went out, not accusing the Threks directly, but redefining the situation. "Economic warfare that results in civilian suffering will be treated as armed aggression," the message said. "Remedial action is in progress." Within hours, the destabilizing market algorithms collapsed, their predictive models rendered useless by subtle changes in underlying assumptions that only human economists seemed to understand. Trade routes reopened as if nothing had happened. The world stabilized, confused but intact. The Threk's leadership reacted with something approaching anger, because for the first time in centuries, a rival had countered them without revealing how. They escalated, quietly at first, then more openly, triggering unrest in multiple systems simultaneously, confident that even humans could not respond everywhere at once. That was when the galaxy learned the second terrible lesson of human power. Humanity did not respond everywhere. They responded nowhere and everywhere simultaneously by altering the rules themselves. A broadcast went out to all known civilizations, redefining the concept of legitimate conflict, establishing consequences not tied to territory or fleets, but to measurable harm. "If you cause suffering beyond your borders," it said, "you will lose the ability to influence events beyond them. No debate, no appeal." The Threks laughed publicly, dismissing the declaration as unenforceable rhetoric. Then their long-range communication arrays began to fail. Their influence networks went dark. Their carefully balanced control systems started isolating themselves, cutting off the continuum from the very civilizations it claimed to manage. For the first time, the Threks felt something unfamiliar: uncertainty. And as they scrambled to understand what humanity had done, a deeper realization began to surface across the galaxy. Humans were not fighting wars. They were ending the conditions that made war possible. The Threk's continuum had never lost a confrontation because it had never truly been confronted before, only accommodated, negotiated with, or quietly obeyed. And the sudden absence of its influence felt like suffocation rather than defeat. Systems that once answered subtle economic pressure now acted independently, making decisions without consulting Threk's advisors, signing treaties without approval, refusing access to data that had once flowed freely. The continuum's leaders gathered in chambers older than most stars on the map, reviewing reports that contradicted centuries of certainty. Because nothing had been destroyed, yet everything they relied on was gone. They had fleets intact and ready, weapons optimized for surgical annihilation, But those tools suddenly felt blunt, designed for a kind of conflict that no longer existed. When they attempted to project force directly, dispatching a task group toward a border system under human protection, the ships arrived on schedule, weapons charged, only to find themselves unacknowledged, ignored by local defenses that simply powered down and refused engagement. No battle occurred, no warning shot fired, just a silent denial of participation that left Threx commanders issuing orders into a void that did not respond. The human message followed hours later, calm and precise, explaining that the task group had not been attacked because attacking them would validate their framework of power, and humanity had no interest in validation. Instead, the ships were now isolated, unable to communicate beyond their immediate formation, their crews safe but effectively removed from the game. Across the galaxy, reactions fractured along familiar lines, with some civilizations expressing relief and others fear, because if humanity could do this to the Threx, they could do it to anyone. Council chambers filled with emergency sessions and whispered speculation, and many listeners leaned in closer than ever, quietly sharing the feeds with friends who loved stories of turning points, sensing they were living through one. The human representatives anticipated the anxiety and addressed it directly in a rare open forum, acknowledging the concern without softening the truth. "We are not here to rule," the speaker said. "We are here to ensure that no one can rule through suffering. If that makes you uncomfortable, ask yourself why." The question lingered uncomfortably because it demanded introspection rather than allegiance. Meanwhile, the Threx adapted because adaptation was their true strength. They shifted tactics away from overt pressure and toward something more insidious, a narrative campaign framing humanity as an unelected arbiter imposing its values on an unwilling galaxy. They amplified fears of cultural erosion, of human standards replacing ancient traditions, of a future where every action was judged by an external moral authority. The campaign spread quickly, especially among species that had once benefited from Threx patronage, and for the first time, protests appeared not against conquest, but against protection. Humans watched the data roll in without surprise, because they had modeled this response long before the first fleet ever moved. They did not counter the narrative directly. They let it breathe, let it spread. Let it reveal which societies valued autonomy only when it shielded them from accountability. Then they made a single adjustment. Access to human technology, medical advances, and energy systems would remain open, but only to civilizations that consented to transparent review of how those tools were used, not controlled, not dictated, simply observed. The effect was immediate and polarizing. Worlds that genuinely sought peace and stability accepted without hesitation, seeing transparency as a small price for progress. Others balked, accusing humanity of coercion, even as they scrambled to find alternatives that did not exist.
The Threx seized on the descent, presenting themselves as champions of sovereignty, offering protection and resources without oversight. And for a brief moment, it seemed like their strategy might work. Several systems openly aligned with the continuum, rejecting human involvement and daring them to respond. Humanity did not intervene. They documented, they recorded, they waited. Months passed, and the aligned systems began experiencing familiar patterns, subtle resource drains, quiet policy shifts, leadership changes justified as necessary for stability. The Threx did not need to conquer them, because they had volunteered. When the suffering began, it was framed as temporary, a necessary adjustment, and when protests were suppressed, it was done by local forces, not Threx fleets. The galaxy watched, uneasy, as the contrast sharpened between worlds that had accepted human oversight and those that had not. One thrived, the other frayed. Finally, a transmission arrived from a world that had rejected humanity and embraced the Threx, its leaders visibly exhausted, asking for help while insisting it was not surrender. Humanity responded by releasing the full, unedited record of that world's alignment, the promises made, the consequences predicted, the choices accepted. "We will help," the human voice said, "but not by undoing your decision.
We will help by ensuring you understand it. Aid arrived alongside data, relief paired with accountability, and for the first time, the Threx saw their most powerful weapon, plausible deniability, stripped away. Across council space, conversations shifted, theories filled comment streams, and even those who distrusted humanity found themselves questioning the alternatives. The Threx leadership, watching influence slip through their grasp, made a decision they had avoided for centuries. They would force a decisive moment, one that could not be reframed or ignored. Deep within their territory, a weapon long considered too destabilizing to use was activated, designed not to destroy worlds, but to erase the infrastructure of interstellar civilization itself. If humanity wanted to remove the concept of victory, the Threx would remove the concept of order. And as sensors across the galaxy registered the first impossible readings, humanity realized the continuum had chosen escalation after all. The first warning did not come as an explosion or an alarm, but as silence where there should have been certainty. A brief moment when navigational beacons failed to resolve, when trade routes blurred into statistical noise, and when ancient relay networks returned results that made no physical sense. Human analysts noticed it immediately, not because it was loud, but because it was wrong in a way only deliberate design could achieve. Entire regions of space were becoming unreliable, not destroyed, not blocked, but probabilistically unstable, as if the rules that allowed civilizations to coordinate across light years were being selectively unstitched. The Threx weapon revealed itself through its effect rather than its form, a cascading field that degraded synchronization, causing clocks to drift, coordinates to misalign, and shared reference frames to fracture until cooperation itself became hazardous. Fleets could still move, weapons could still fire, but without reliable context, every action risked catastrophic miscalculation. This was not an extinction bomb. It was worse. It was a civilizational isolation engine, turning the galaxy into a maze of disconnected local truths. Panic followed quickly among species whose entire existence depended on interstellar coherence, and emergency councils convened in overlapping layers of confusion as delegates argued using data sets that no longer agreed with each other. The Threx broadcast a single message through channels hardened against the effect, their tone almost regretful, as they explained that order required hierarchy, and hierarchy required consequences, and if the galaxy would not accept their structure willingly, it would endure the absence of any structure at all. Humanity listened without interruption, because interruption implied negotiation, and negotiation implied the possibility of compromise. Instead, they focused inward, activating protocols that had never been shared, even with their closest allies. Measures built not for winning wars, but for surviving the aftermath of losing everything. On human worlds, infrastructure shifted modes, trading efficiency for resilience, decentralizing authority in ways that looked chaotic to outsiders, but preserved function under uncertainty. The adjustment was not dramatic, it was quiet, methodical, and terrifyingly fast. While others scrambled to understand what was happening, humanity was already operating inside the degraded environment, navigating by relative context rather than absolute reference, using adaptive heuristics instead of fixed coordinates. The difference was cultural as much as technical. Humans had evolved expecting systems to fail, plans to break, and assumptions to betray them. And they had built redundancy into their thinking long before they built it into their machines. As weeks passed, the contrast became impossible to ignore. Human ships continued to arrive where they intended, their trade still flowing, their communications noisy but intelligible, while entire regions of the galaxy descended into paralysis, afraid to act without certainty that no longer existed. Observers whispered that humanity seemed unaffected, but the truth was worse. They were affected. They were simply not surprised. The Threx, confident in their escalation, moved to consolidate control over the fractured systems, deploying fleets to enforce order now that resistance was disorganized. That was when they encountered something they had not predicted.
Human forces did not oppose them directly. They did not defend territory or contest space. Instead, they began extracting people. Entire populations vanished from threatened systems, relocated through methods that exploited the very instability the Threx had unleashed, slipping through probabilistic gaps that their own weapon created. The rescues were selective, prioritizing those most at risk, leaving infrastructure intact but hollow, worlds alive but emptied of strategic value. The Threx accused humanity of theft, of destabilizing already fragile regions, and humanity did not deny it. "We are removing the stakes," the response said. "You cannot win if there is nothing left to fight over." The galaxy reeled at the implication, because this was not defense or offense, but denial of relevance. As systems emptied, the Threx found themselves occupying planets that no longer mattered, holding space that no longer anchored influence, enforcing order over silence. Among neutral worlds still functioning, conversations turned urgent, theories spreading through every remaining channel, and those listening closely felt the gravity of the moment, compelled to share it with others who needed to understand how close everything was to unraveling. Humanity addressed the broader audience only once during this phase, a rare direct appeal that acknowledged the fear without diminishing it. "We know this feels like abandonment," the human voice said. "It is not. It is triage. Stay adaptive. Stay connected where you can. Watch carefully what follows." And then, as if to underline the point, humanity made a move that shocked even their allies. They publicly released a framework explaining how to operate within the degraded space-time environment, not as a controlled technology, but as open knowledge, giving everyone the tools to survive without central coordination. The act was framed as humanitarian, but its strategic impact was immediate. The Threx monopoly on hardened systems evaporated overnight, and with it, their leverage. Furious, the Continuum leadership realized too late that they had accelerated the very outcome they feared, a galaxy no longer dependent on any single axis of power. In desperation, they prepared to trigger the weapon's final phase, a collapse mode that would permanently sever interstellar coherence, ensuring no one, including humanity, could ever rebuild what was lost. As the countdown sequences began, human sensors confirmed the worst-case projections, and for the first time, a quiet urgency entered their internal communications. This was the line they had hoped never to cross, because stopping the Threx now would require revealing the final measure humanity had kept hidden, a choice that would change the galaxy forever. And as the clock ticked down, the question was no longer whether humanity could stop them, but what the price of stopping them would be. Human leadership did not argue about whether to act, because the moment for debate had passed long before the Threx initiated their final sequence, and what remained was not strategy, but responsibility. The collapse mode would not discriminate, not between empires or ideals, not between aggressors and bystanders, and once triggered, it would lock the galaxy into a permanent state of isolation, where every civilization would be alone forever, unable to rebuild a shared future even if they survived the present. That outcome violated the single boundary humanity had set for itself, the line drawn beneath all other considerations, because consequences that could never be repaired were not deterrence, but annihilation by another name. The authorization chain moved quickly, not because the decision was easy, but because it had been prepared for decades in silence, a contingency acknowledged only in the most restricted circles, a plan whose existence alone would have terrified the galaxy if it had ever been revealed. Human systems shifted again, deeper this time, withdrawing from shared networks entirely, retreating into an internal architecture designed to function even if reality itself became unreliable. From the outside, it looked like humanity was vanishing, their signals fading, their presence receding, just as the Threx weapon reached critical synchronization. The Continuum interpreted this as confirmation of victory. Their leadership broadcast a final declaration, framing the imminent collapse as proof that resistance to hierarchy led only to ruin, and promising that those who survived within Threx-controlled space would inherit the future. The irony was almost surgical. Humanity did not respond publicly. They spoke only to themselves across channels that no longer relied on conventional physics, aligning consensus not through command, but through shared understanding of what was about to be done. The measure they prepared to deploy was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It did not destroy ships or worlds or even infrastructure. It targeted something far more abstract and far more dangerous to remove. It targeted escalation itself. At the heart of the Threx system, embedded deep within the logic that governed their continuum-wide command protocols, was a principle they had never questioned, that conflict was a ladder, that every action could be met with a greater one, that dominance was proven through upward force. Humanity had spent years studying that assumption, mapping how it propagated through Threx culture, doctrine, and decision-making, and now they moved to sever it. Using the same probabilistic instability the Threx had unleashed, humanity injected a recursive constraint into the Continuum's strategic framework, a self-enforcing condition that redefined acceptable outcomes. Any action taken to gain advantage would automatically propagate consequences that nullified that advantage, not through retaliation, but through systemic feedback, making escalation mathematically pointless. It was not mind control, it was not sabotage, it was a reframing of possibility, a quiet rewriting of the rules under which the Threx believed victory could exist. The moment the constraint took hold, Threx command systems began rejecting their own orders, flagging them as invalid not because they were unethical, but because they led nowhere. Fleet deployments stalled, weapon activations aborted, and the collapse sequence itself entered a loop, unable to progress because its end state no longer satisfied the criteria for success. Confusion tore through Threx leadership as their instruments insisted that escalation reduced power rather than increased it, that every aggressive move diminished their strategic position until inaction became the only viable option.
They attempted to override the systems manually, only to discover that the constraint was not localized but conceptual, embedded across every layer of coordination, mirrored in their simulations, their predictions, even their training doctrines. Humanity had not attacked their forces, they had attacked their idea of winning. Across the galaxy, sensors registered the stabilization of space-time as the collapse mode stalled indefinitely, and relief surged alongside a new, deeper unease, because something unprecedented had occurred. A war had been stopped not by superior force, but by removing the incentive to continue it. Humanity finally addressed the wider galaxy, their transmission steady but heavy with implication. "The conflict is over," the speaker said, "not because anyone surrendered, but because no outcome remains that justifies further harm." The message rippled outward, and reactions fractured between awe and fear, because if humanity could do this, they had effectively positioned themselves as arbiters of consequence, capable of ending wars by redefining their meaning. Within the Threx continuum, panic gave way to something tolder, a realization that their dominance had not been defeated but rendered obsolete, their future trapped in equilibrium enforced by an external moral architecture. And deep within human councils, another truth settled, one they did not share.
because the constraint they had deployed was not limited to the Threx. It was universal by design, a precedent written into the fabric of interstellar interaction. The galaxy would never escalate the same way again, and humanity had just accepted the burden of being blamed for whatever came next. As analysts began detecting subtle shifts in other powers, adaptations forming, loopholes being explored, one question echoed quietly through human deliberations. What happens when someone finds a way to weaponize restraint itself?
The galaxy did not immediately react. For days, weeks, even months, entire empires remained frozen in disbelief, unsure whether the humans had acted or whether the universe itself had simply changed. Trade convoys stalled in space, fleets loitered at staging points, council chambers emptied as representatives struggled to understand what had just occurred. The Threx, their fleets immobilized, attempted to assert control through traditional intimidation, sending signals and demands. But every communication was met with the same reality. Escalation no longer conferred advantage. They tried calculations, simulations, even brute force tests, only to watch their assumptions crumble before their own eyes. And then the humans appeared. Not with fleets roaring through hyperspace, not with bombs and fire, but with emissaries moving with precision, calm, and purpose. Ships arrived in system after system, not to conquer, not to threaten, but to stabilize. Every world they visited felt the same thing, an invisible alignment of consequence, a subtle gravitational pull toward restraint, negotiation, and measured action. Planets that had been on the verge of civil war, fleets ready to fire, suddenly paused, their commanders' instincts quieted by systems that demanded reflection. Observers in council stations watched in awe as human diplomats walked corridors once filled with tension and threat, and yet they spoke no threats themselves. The message was clear. Humans were not playing the same game. Ambassador after ambassador began reporting back, describing encounters that defied conventional understanding. Trade disputes resolved before they escalated, rogue fleets voluntarily standing down, warlords and conquerors reduced to negotiation tables without a single shot fired. Each report added weight to a new and terrifying truth. Humans were the first species in galactic history to weaponize morality itself. But even as this reality sank in, there were pockets of resistance, species who refused to accept restraint as a form of power. The Threx, the most aggressive among them, began whispering of rebellion, of secret strikes, of covert attacks on humans and their allies. Humanity expected this. Every move had been anticipated, every scenario rehearsed. And when the Threx attempted a feint, human tactical units appeared not to destroy, but to contain, neutralizing entire fleets without casualties, removing weapons from firing positions, isolating command systems without harm, a method that was surgical, efficient, and utterly disorienting to those who had always judged strength by destruction. The galaxy began to murmur. Scholars, soldiers, diplomats, all started revising the definition of power. It was no longer fleets, armies, or territorial claims. Power was measured in survival, in prevention, in the ability to choose mercy over massacre and to enforce consequences without killing. But the humans were not done. Quietly, systematically, they began gathering intelligence on every major conflict, every potential outbreak, every hidden cache of weapons capable of toppling governments. In every case, humans intervened not to fight, but to reset the calculus. Entire wars ceased mid-escalation. Armadas disbanded before they could launch, and each time, humans reminded the galaxy of a single, terrifying principle. Victory was no longer defined by what you could destroy, but by what remained intact after the war ended. The Threx reacted with confusion and panic. Their simulations failed. Their strategies backfired. For the first time in 10,000 years, the most feared military species in galactic history realized they had been measuring power completely wrong. They had judged humanity as weak because humans lacked the appearance of overwhelming force. They had assumed that fleets, weapons, and territory were the ultimate metric of dominance. They had been blind. And now, as the humans walked through what had once been Threx-controlled space, the galaxy began to see the cost of misjudgment. Planets that had been considered conquered were untouched, civilian populations safe, resources intact, and yet the Threx could do nothing. Every attempt at retaliation collapsed under the weight of consequences that humans could enforce, but no other species could. Somewhere deep in human command centers, strategists watched as Threx leaders contemplated their mistakes. And in a private message to the galaxy's remaining empires, the humans sent a final, chilling note. Anyone can destroy a world. Power is being able to stop and choosing not to. As the message echoed through channels, entire civilizations shivered, realizing they were no longer measuring strength by firepower, but by self-control, by morality, by the terrifying, deliberate patience of a species they had long underestimated. But even as awe and fear spread, one question remained in every council chamber, every fleet command, every hidden war room. If humanity could enforce restraint across thousands of light years, what would they do when they decided no one could resist their judgment? And somewhere beyond the edge of charted space, an ancient species, long thought extinct, took note. The galaxy's calculations had failed again, and the first true test of human consequence was about to begin.
The galaxy held its breath. Systems that had been on the brink of collapse, entire empires poised for final assaults, fleets stretching across sectors, all froze in unison. Not because humans fired a single shot, not because they unleashed a weapon, but because the very concept of victory had been rewritten. For the first time, civilizations understood that they were being judged not by what they could destroy, but by what remained after they chose to act. Council chambers that had once buzzed with debate over territorial claims now sat in uneasy silence as Marcus Washington's voice, Earth's ambassador, reverberated across communication networks. "The age of conquest ends today," he said, steady and calm, yet carrying a weight that felt almost physical. "Not because you lack power, but because you have been unable to recognize the consequences of your power. You were measured wrongly. We measured differently. Your fleets, your weapons, your empires, they meant nothing if the lives, the systems, and the potential of the galaxy are destroyed in the process. Humanity has been patient for centuries, watching, learning, understanding every species, every pattern, every failure. That patience ends when the consequence of inaction or aggression threatens all life. And then the humans acted. Not with fleets descending like storms, not with fire tearing through worlds, but with a series of decisions so simple and yet so terrifying that the galaxy would remember them forever. Strategic outposts that had been planning invasions found their armadas disarmed remotely, weapons rendered inoperable, fleets held in stasis without casualties, entire planetary sieges halted instantly. And every step carried the same chilling message. Humans had the power to destroy, yes, but the measure of true strength was in choosing to preserve.
from Threk's command centers to the hidden councils of the Elah, from warlords who had amassed billions of lives under their control, to scientists experimenting with weapons of mass extinction. Every mind understood simultaneously they had underestimated humans, and underestimation now carried existential consequences. Veltar, seated aboard what remained of the hegemony command station, felt the weight of that realization crush him. He had once measured power in fleets and artillery, in speed and firepower. He had been certain of humanity's weakness. Now he knew he had been blind. Humanity had not only stopped a war that should have destroyed them, they had removed the very concept of victory from it. The galaxy's greatest military minds, strategists who had survived countless wars, were left scrambling to understand a species that had spent centuries learning the true cost of conflict. They realized in quiet moments of terror and awe that if humans had wished, they could have eradicated entire empires in a single decision. But they had chosen not to. And in that choice, the galaxy understood a new rule. Power was not what you could take. Power was what you could leave untouched.
As Earth's diplomatic fleet moved silently between systems, establishing contact, opening trade, preventing wars, and mediating disputes, civilizations began to shift. The old metrics of dominance, territory, fleet size, weapon strength, were replaced by a far more subtle, far more dangerous calculus. Influence now came from restraint, from foresight, from moral authority that could compel compliance without firing a shot. And yet, even as the galaxy bent to this new reality, a tremor of uncertainty ran through every empire. If humans had judged consequences this carefully, if they had acted with such precision, what else had they been preparing? Marcus Washington spoke once more to the assembled councils, his voice calm, carrying that quiet authority that made even the most aggressive species pause. We are not here to rule. We are here to ensure survival, justice, and the balance of life. But understand this: if any species chooses to ignore consequence, if any empire insists that destruction is the path to power, humanity will act. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but with precision, with finality, and with full awareness of every outcome. We will stop you, and no measure of firepower will allow you to resist what you cannot survive. The galaxy trembled, not at the threat of destruction, but at the implication of restraint as a weapon more devastating than any fleet or supernova. Every species now realized the truth they had long ignored. Humans were predators, yes, but predators unlike any other. Predators who did not need to kill to dominate, who did not need to conquer to enforce authority, who measured power not by what was broken, but by what remained whole. And somewhere, in the farthest reaches of uncharted space, civilizations that had long hidden, waiting for the galaxy to self-destruct, watched humanity's careful, deliberate dance of consequence, and whispered in disbelief, "They are nothing like we imagined. They are worse." Outside the council chambers, the stars seemed unchanged, cold and distant. But humanity had shifted the very gravity of the galaxy, bending every species to a new understanding, rewriting rules that had endured for millennia. And in that silence, in that moment before the first new war could even begin, the galaxy collectively realized the final, terrifying truth. The humans had not come to conquer. They had come to ensure the galaxy could not conquer them or anyone else again. And as every observer wondered what would come next, one certainty settled across every world, every fleet, every council, and every hidden observer. Humanity's patience had limits, and when those limits were reached, the universe itself would bend to their choice. The age of conquest had ended. The age of consequence had begun.